Coming up on this episode of Flirtations, we have licensed marriage and family therapist and dating coach Lauren Zamora to talk about one of the hottest topics when it comes to dating and relationships. Attachment theory. Together, we're breaking down what attachment theory is, how our attachment styles develop and the different types, and what it truly means to feel secure in love and relationships. We'll also explore the core wounds behind both anxious and avoidant attachment styles, how these wounds show up in dating, and why the anxious avoidant dynamic plays out so often. Why does this duo seem to attract one another? Plus, we'll discuss communication, whether attachment styles follow gender roles, and perhaps most importantly, how to start healing attachment wounds and build a more secure, connected relationship with both yourself and with others. If you're ready to deepen your self-awareness and create more secure, fulfilling relationships, this episode is for you. Let's go, flirties. Time to meet Lauren.
I heard you wanted to flirt. I heard you wanted to flirt. I heard you wanted to flirt. Hello, my name is Benjamin. I'm the flirt coach and a gay Libra. Everyone has an inner flirt.
Hey, flirty.
Live, laugh, flirt.
Work the flirt.
Work the flirt. Delulu is the Salulu. Expert on the flirt.
Hey, flirty. There's always another flirt.
Everyone has an inner flirt. Get out of your head and into the flirt.
Flirties, we're going to have a really cool and exciting discussion today with Lauren Zamora, licensed marriage and family therapist, all about attachment styles. Hey, Lauren.
Hi, how are you?
I am doing well. I've been looking forward to this all day and bringing this episode to the Flirties, as I have kind of famously said or infamously said on my social media before that I've really had to come around to the attachment theory and attachment.
Okay, interesting. What do you mean by that?
It was just something, honestly, I resisted for the longest time. I didn't fully understand it, and the way I felt like it was presented to me, through social media, which is where I live a lot of the time. It just it was hard for me to wrap my mind around. But now that I've really started to read some of the books, be with the material, just the concept and the theory, I'm like, wait, hold up. I get it now. It's actually really, really interesting and also really healing to understand your dynamics and how you show up, not just in your relationships, but as the attachment theory and attachment styles apply to all of your connections, your friendships. Yeah. It's really universal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So excited to get into it today, as I think this is going to be a big learning experience for me as well. For the flirties that are getting to know you for the first time through this episode, I'd love if you could share a little bit more about yourself and what inspired you to get into the work you do.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. So, I've been a therapist since 2020, officially out of grad school, but I was doing therapy previously. I became a therapist because kind of the same way a lot of therapists become a therapist, because I had a lot of childhood shit going on that, caused me to want to understand people more, understand the way our brains work, why we act the way that we act. But also because I was kind of my own little therapist in my family and my friendships, which kind of helped me realize maybe that's a strength of mine. But obviously because of maladaptive childhood, right? Yes. But I got into the dating coaching side of it and how I specialize in attachment because of my own journey as a fellow single girl trying to figure out how to navigate dating and relationships. And I was really struggling for a long time. I was single for 7 years. I really found myself in a lot of what I like to call almost relationships where, kind of that 3-month mark hits and then things end. And it really lowered my self-worth. I started to feel like I wasn't good enough. Something was wrong with me. I was going to be alone forever. And while my friends were there for me in some ways, I think a lot of times I felt like they made me feel worse about it almost. Like, oh my gosh, Lauren, you're just you need to focus on yourself. You need to love yourself more. It's because you don't need a relationship that bad. Why aren't you having fun being single? Like
Yeah.
that's your problem.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of self shame, a lot of what's wrong with me. And then as I became a therapist, there was a lot of imposter syndrome there. Like I'm literally going to school to be a marriage and family therapist and I can't figure this out. Like
Yeah.
what's wrong with me? How could I be a therapist? And so I really dove into my own trauma work and I went to a trauma retreat. I worked with a really great therapist that helped me do a lot of healing in my own attachment wounds,
Yeah.
which led me to my husband now. And so once I did all of that healing and kind of figured out like what, like not just on a professional level, but a personal level, like what we really need in order to, find a person that's good for us and how to be attracted to someone who's good for us, is a lot of attachment work and healing. And that's became such like a big passion of mine was I really wanted to help people find love, find
Mhm.
healthy love. And I think like it's not even just about healing attachment wounds, but it's about learning how to be attracted to people who are good for you. And
Mm.
so that's a big one and that became just a huge passion project for me and then it all kind of happened organically from a random Facebook group post of like, hey, like I have this idea. I would love to do a group for women who struggle with dating and here's kind of what I'm, specializing in and like
Mhm.
so many women were like, "Oh my gosh, sign me up right away." And so I like frantically created an Instagram and had a group within like a week.
Yes.
And it just all organically happened from there.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And it's grown from there. I love when we find our purpose through healing. We find our
Mhm.
passion, that thing that lights us up and really brings fulfillment, deepens the connection we have with ourselves
Yeah.
through healing. So I also know you're a new mama. And so I want to ask you what's it like being a mom?
It's great. I mean, there's obviously a lot of challenges that come with it, a lot of
Yeah.
sleep deprivation. But I love every second of it. I think it's really healing and special that I had a daughter first because,
Mhm.
as like I feel like she's gonna help me heal my inner child even more, just like
Yeah.
seeing my little self through her
Yeah.
essentially and like what she deserves. It teaches you a lot of patience. It
Yes.
definitely helps me like continue to want to heal and to really like continue my coping skills and learning how
Mhm.
to self-soothe when overstimulated and
Mm.
overwhelmed because she deserves that.
Yeah.
And also I love working while having a baby.
Uh-huh.
I really think that's important to have my identity outside of being a mom.
Yeah.
And it actually fills my cup up so much that I'm better with her when I have that time away.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, maybe something I'll experience one day being a father or parenthood in general. But for now, I have my cat Sugar, and I'd say she also helps me from time to time heal my inner child, and just it brings you something about taking care of something or really seeing the innocence, the purity of just someone's being, of their soul. It brings you back to the moment, right? It just takes sort of all the stressors or the worries away, sort of what all may be going on in your mind, and it's like, oh wait, hold up, this is what's important.
100%. I mean, and I will say, like, having your own fur babies, like, that helps you heal so much too. It really does. Like, my dog was my first, well, actually, my cats were my first babies. And
Yeah.
I think there's something special as an adult having your first animal where, like, they fully rely on you. You're fully responsible for them, and you
Yeah.
have to be less selfish and put their needs first. And I think
Yeah.
it can be super healing.
Yeah.
So I think that's great.
I think so too. As we're going to be getting into this, was so great just to learn more about you and your inspiration to do the work you do. And I think I want to start. We're going to be getting into attachment styles, attachment theory, right? You probably, the flirties listening, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, of course, secure. So that's kind of, well, not kind of, what we'll definitely be talking about today. But I wanted to start here with where we may end up, sort of starting with that takeaway, maybe a hope you have for the flirties listening that are in the midst of dating, figuring things out, feeling anxious, maybe avoidant, both. Yeah, kind of one hope you have for the end of the episode.
I guess I would say I hope that the takeaway is that you're already good enough and that you don't need to be fully healed in order to find love. You don't need to figure anything out. You don't need to listen to this and go take notes and run off and go, okay, this is how I can get someone to love me. Like, you're
Yeah.
already lovable. You're already worthy. And that's part of the work, is learning to believe that.
Absolutely. A huge, huge part of it, because it starts in it with you, right? This, the longest relationship you'll ever have is with yourself. And when it, yes, we're going to be getting more into that too. And I think for me, I feel like one of the big takeaways that I want for the flirties listening is just to like have that one puzzle piece from this conversation that shifts something into place. They make a new connection, they develop a new understanding about a habit, a pattern, a thought, a behavior. And with that new awareness, they're then able to take action and shift the dynamics of how they're dating, how they're making connections, forming relationships. And so that, plus the mindset piece that you offered of knowing you're good, you're whole, right? You're totally worthy and deserving of love as you exist, just as you are today. I think we're going to rock it.
Yeah, I think so
Oh
too.
my gosh. So what, I think we need to start here and ground us in attachment theory. What is attachment theory, and what are the main attachment styles?
Yeah. So attachment theory, well, I mean, I won't get into the like
Yeah.
facts and the history of it
Take
all,
us back the whole
but
history, Lauren.
yeah, and yeah. But I mean, attachment theory is created by John Bowlby. But aside from that, I mean, attachment theory really is, our attachment styles are created from really early age of about 18 months to 5 years old. Those are really like our most impactful times of development where that attachment style is going to show up. And then we have 4 different attachment styles that develop in that time period. It's either an anxious attachment, an avoidant attachment, disorganized, or secure. And I do want to just add in there that, like, this isn't to villainize your parents either. Like, most parents did the absolute best they could. And there's a lot of generational trauma that's passed down. And to their credit, there wasn't a lot of information about mental health and emotion regulation and coping skills, pre-millennial generation. And so I just like to add that in, that like you can empathize with your parents and not think they're the worst people ever. And they could have, created some insecure attachment styles and some struggles.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I think, highlighting a little bit one of the maybe struggles I had really understanding attachment theory, because I feel like I did have great parents who were present in my life and loved me really hard. My parents divorced when I was 7, but they were still right local. They worked together. They co-parented beautifully. And so I always had that love in my life. And so why did I develop the attachment styles that I do, that I have? I think it's, a lot of, yes, your familial dynamics, of course. Also how you identify, if you're queer or somewhere in that spectrum, just how I think your personality has a lot to do with it as well. And what I've just come to understand about attachment theory is that attachment styles, a big part of it is how safe you feel to express yourself, to advocate for your needs, to even know and be able to identify what those are, and tying that to the relationship you have with validation, with reassurance, with just wanting to feel like good enough outside of yourself. As I'm starting to learn and understand more about it, it's really fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, and I will add too that it's not just our caregivers. It can be, and also caregivers can be a grandparent you spend a lot of time with. It could be a teacher. It could be a coach. So there's other figures that can totally impact that. And that could be a reason why you might show up secure in friendships that are with a certain gender and not with another. And then also to add in there, like, trauma and like significant first romantic relationships, other relational traumas that happen, which could definitely especially happen in the queer community, right? Like, as you're speaking to, that can change your attachment style. So you could have started out really secure from your caregivers and then had some trauma that kind of took you out of that secure place. And so there's definitely different areas. It's not all of our childhood,
Yeah.
But to speak to your point too, like since the most impactful part of our attachment is that 18 to 3-year-old mark, like even pre like 5 years old, we can still be developing, but it's really that 18 months to 3 years old. And so a lot of it you might not remember, and it can be seemingly small, right? It's like a mom not attending to her baby's needs as quickly one day as the other, right? And there might be like a constant inconsistency where maybe
Mm,
one night she's so tired, she just ignores you and lets you cry and doesn't attend to your needs and feed you and change your diaper. And then the next day she's emotionally available and she's there for you.
yeah.
That could create some anxious attachment. So it's really
Mm.
fascinating. It's really insane and amazing how much those younger years when you're so tiny really affect you as an adult.
Yeah, how your parents tended to you, cared for you before you even had the awareness and knowledge to like form these memories. Which I
Mhm.
mean, right? The body remembers everything,
Yeah.
so the conditioning is happening. And you're picking up on things even if you don't have the memories right there accessible to you. So interesting. I mean, we could go all the way down the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole and spend the whole conversation here.
And where daddy at, y'all? Maybe we're a single mama. I don't know.
But I want to definitely get into different dating questions, scenarios, all that good stuff that the flirties submitted. So you mentioned a moment ago the 4 attachment styles: anxious, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. Let's start with talking about anxious attachment a little bit. What are some of the ways that anxious attachment presents itself in dating
Yeah.
specifically?
Well, as someone who grew up with an anxious attachment style,
Yeah.
that's kind of my specialty. That's who I work with the most. Not that I'm against working with other attachment styles, but anxious attachment, I mean, it's pretty like straightforward, right? We have a lot of over analyzing, a lot of anxiety, a lot of being suspicious, jealous, untrustworthy. But the big part of like anxious attachment is being so focused on the other person's behavior, over analyzing everything they do. Most people with an anxious attachment style are also very sensitive to energy shifts. So they feel the slightest thing is off. Again, they're kind of think everything is about them. And so there's a lot of personalizing of the other person's behavior. Why
Okay.
aren't they texting me back? It must be something I've done, or they don't like me anymore. They're not interested in me anymore. Right. Or it can get into that self sabotaging behavior where maybe they don't trust them. They think they always assume the worst case scenario. So then they start becoming so anxious that they end it before that person can reject them.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how the anxious attack shows up.
Okay. And how about some of the avoidant tendencies? Yes.
Yeah.
Behaviors in dating.
Well, and I want to say, I think avoidant, like, there's so much, negativity around an avoidant. They get a bad rep, but they also have deep childhood wounds, and they're not malicious or like out to hurt you. But avoidant people, they tend to be really overwhelmed by emotion. They're really not that emotionally available because they're not really very attuned with their own emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So they tend to feel really overwhelmed if you start asking for things that are really reasonable in a relationship, but they might feel like it's too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll pull away. Maybe they don't want to be responsible for your emotions. And so they feel like you said something like, hey, that hurt my feelings. And they immediately pull back, and maybe even ghost you sometimes can show up in dating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a big thing for anxious people to realize is that, it's really easy to think like they did this maliciously and they're such a horrible person, but it's really they're doing that in their own coping for their own childhood wounds that we can talk about in a second. But
Yeah.
it's really not as much about you as it feels like it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, and it's like one of the things, like, because we're quick to, and I'm curious what you think about this. Label quickly the avoidant as the narcissist, or
Mhm.
someone before you even had a first date. You just got to know someone on the apps, and based on their communication or their messaging style, oh, they're an avoidant, or oh, they're an anxious. And I think we need to get to know people outside of sort of categorizing their attachment style for them. And
Yeah.
I think, like, what do you is your attachment style something that is pretty much going to show up over time,
Mm.
or does it kind of show up right
Mhm.
away?
I would say it can take time. I think that I'll just go from like an anxious lens, right? I think a lot of people with an anxious attachment, they show up in dating really disingenuine. And I speak
Hmm.
for myself in this, right? So
Mhm.
kind of like showing up for a second date, they're really focused on getting the other person to like them. So they put on quite a persona.
Mhm.
They've been told so many times that they should play hard to get or they should be mysterious. So they kind of act cool and chill and avoid like, what are you looking for questions and avoid vulnerability, even though their nature would be to go there right away, but they don't act like themselves. And so then what do? They attract an avoidant because the avoidant's like, cool, you're not being really highly emotional. You're not talking about anything too deep.
Yeah.
You're kind of like fine with all this ambiguous language, which shows me maybe you don't need a commitment. It's
Mhm.
all good, right? And
Mhm.
then the anxious person, like, they start showing their true self a little bit on accident.
Okay.
And then the avoidant starts pulling away. And then we see kind of that game playing that it feels like. But I think a lot of times the anxious person reels in the avoidant by not showing up authentic in the
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah, so good. That was definitely one of my questions I have here. I wanted to ask you about some of the classic, right,
Hmm.
attachment style pairings. And the one that I think, are most familiar with is this anxious attracting the avoidant.
Hmm.
And you broke it down so beautifully about why that pairing just seems to attract one
Hmm.
another.
Yeah, well, and I think the anxious person has qualities that an avoidant likes, right? Like I think they do
Mhm.
tend to be really authentic. Like if they're being genuine, right? They have like this vulnerable side. They're fun. They're, usually a pretty like big personality, which can be
Yep.
charming as well.
Yep.
And that's attractive, right? So there are attractive parts to an avoidant, but then once you start asking for more, that's when they're gonna pull away. And so I think you can avoid that absolutely by showing up authentic from date one, by asking the like serious questions, like even on the app before you meet up, like, hey, what are
Mhm.
you looking for? What are your intentions here? That's going to show you really quickly. You could find out someone's avoidant right away if they're like, I don't know, like, we'll see where things go. I'm just going with the flow. Like, that's a pretty good sign they're probably going to be avoidant.
Yep.
But anxious people tend to not want to ask those questions, so they find out a little later.
Absolutely. And Lauren, what do you think? What do you think my attachment style is?
I mean, if I had to guess, and this
Mhm.
is like just from all your posting, and like
Yeah.
I think that you show up really authentically, but you also said, I'm confused about my attachment style because my parents were so great. So I'm going to assume that's an insecure attachment style. I would guess you're anxious.
Hmm. I
Am
mean,
I right?
you're definitely right. You're on the money. I'm like an equal opportunity employer when it comes to attachment styles. Why pick?
Mm.
I'm going to be both. So I think my
Yeah.
true attachment style is disorganized because I
Okay.
definitely present up front, or and this is, I mean, how I used to almost
Mm-hmm.
exclusively date, really presenting anxiously at first, but that wasn't what was visible or what was noticeable. It was, right, I wanted to be the cool guy, right? Just, easy breezy, go with the flow, whatever you want. I didn't want to ruffle feathers. I just wanted the other person to like me. But then the
Mm-hmm.
avoidant tendencies would come up where, you know what, I wasn't asking the questions. What are you looking for? What kind of relationship do you want? Are you looking for a relationship? A lot of my relationships stayed relatively superficial, and I did what I needed to do to keep them from going deeper because I myself didn't feel comfortable or really connected to who I was. And so I didn't want to go super deep. So it's like, it's weird. I kind of led with the more anxious, which was
Mm-hmm.
hidden behind the scenes until my anxiety would, of course, show up. And then, if a relationship lasted for a little while, maybe more than a month, then I felt like the avoidant tendencies would come
Okay.
out.
That's interesting. So I feel like we don't talk about disorganized very often. And, I'm not going to get into a whole therapy session with you and like try to get into your life trauma. But I will say, like, I thought I was disorganized too, because
Hmm.
I kind of did the same thing, right? That like you play it cool at first, but you're like anxious behind the scenes,
Yep.
but then maybe you're avoidant because you don't bring up the stuff. Now, I'm not telling you what yours is because that you know yourself best, but I would just put out there that there's a possibility that is still very anxious attached.
Okay.
And, there's like that avoidance of like you're trying to play it cool because you think that's what the other person would want you to do.
Yeah.
And then kind of that fear of being vulnerable because you don't want to scare them away and you don't want to push them away, which is still that like anxious the anxious kind of lens.
Okay.
I would say disorganized. The reason it's not talked about, I think, enough is because it's really usually significant trauma that causes disorganized attachment. And the difference with disorganized is that, like what you're saying, right? It's like I act this way and then I act this way, but it all kind of has the same goal is like, I just want to keep this person.
Yes.
Versus a disorganized person, they're like, they want love so bad, but they're also absolutely terrified of love. They're terrified of attachment. So there's like this, so they're very confused within themselves. There's this push pull behavior, not just in like the dating relationship, but within themselves of like, I want this connection, but I also can't trust anyone. And I'm so scared of it.
Yeah.
And so we might see disorganized more with personality disorders, more severe mental health issues. Not always. Some people can have trauma without, those, categorizing of behavior. But that's what I would say is like, it's more like obvious, like from the get-go where you're kind of doing both simultaneously, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. That's really interesting. I appreciate the hot seat, right? Reflection, because this is helpful for me as I'm very much learning throughout this conversation. And I wanted to come back to something you mentioned a few moments ago. Maybe a couple of the core wounds that each of the two big ones will say, or the anxious and avoidant, that they may have.
Absolutely. So I think, overall, the anxious person is afraid of being abandoned. They're afraid of rejection. They really, really just want to be loved. And then I'm trying to keep this short and sweet because I can go so deep.
Yes.
And the avoidant person, I would say like they're really afraid of losing their independence. And that is typically because their independence is a way for them to protect themselves. So oftentimes with an avoidant, they had a caregiver that was either highly critical of them, really emotionally unavailable. So they really never like saw any emotion from their parent or ever like maybe not very many I love yous or physical affection. Or their parent was overly reliant on them. Maybe their parent, was like had some mental illness and was like always kind of really emotional, like, needing that kid to be their parent.
Yeah.
Or they had a parent who was really combative and or had an addiction or something like that. And that kid felt like they had to be their parent. So then what they do is, right, it's all, I'm not good enough. Like the avoidant does not feel like they're good enough. And so they really keep themselves protected in that independence. Right. If my parents highly critical of me, I don't feel like I'm ever going to be good enough for them. So I'm going to show up for myself and I'm going to be really independent. Yeah. If my parent like is overly needy, then like that's the last thing I ever want to be around as soon as I get out of that household. Like I'm on my own. I got my own back. I don't want anyone to rely on me ever again. Yeah. Or right, like the parents just doesn't show any emotion, so they don't know what to do with emotions. That's really confusing for them. So they're going to rely on themselves and their independence versus the anxious person. Their caregiver is usually inconsistent. They can be really emotionally supportive sometimes and maybe other times not supportive at all. I see this a lot with like maybe moms who can be really great when their kid's upset about someone else and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I love you so much. Like I'm here for you. But if the kid comes to them and says, Mom, you hurt my feelings. I didn't like what you did. And mom's immediately mad at you. Like you're ungrateful. I thought I've done all these things for you. So that would be mom being really inconsistent of like, I can be emotionally supportive in some ways, but in other ways, I'm not at all. Yeah. And so there can create some hypervigilance there of, what am I going to get today?
Yeah. That's so interesting. I mean, some of the puzzle pieces are shifting into place for me where I can see some of these themes that I'm sure you see and I see out there dating too, of you have hyper independence, right? That's a huge thing that is that a lot of people have that is preventing them in many ways. It's a barrier to letting someone in, to letting that love
Mhm.
in, to just
Yeah.
opening your heart and your life to even what if. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got, of course, the fear of rejection, which everyone has, but that abandonment, that
Mhm.
at any point they're just going to leave me. And there's kind of, yeah, this underlying core wound of not feeling good enough, of like, I have to earn it, I have to prove it, right? I have to chase it. Like that was me, just always trying to
Mhm.
constantly keep that person, whatever I had to do in my life, because the thought of losing them felt
Mhm.
far worse than like anything you could imagine.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I would even argue that the avoidant also is afraid of rejection,
Mm, okay.
because they were rejected a lot in their
Yeah.
childhood typically, right? Emotionally or critically, or the parent is it's all about them.
Yeah.
And so the avoidant doesn't wanna be rejected either, but their independence is like their safe space. So if someone that they're dating, they feel like they're taking that away from them, they will reject that person also before they could reject them, because maybe they don't feel good enough when the anxious person is like, hey, like I didn't like when you didn't text me back yesterday, like that hurt my feelings. That would be a healthy thing for an anxious person to say, but the avoidant might be like, oh, see, I'm not good enough. I'm
Mm,
not good enough, so like I'm not
yeah.
even gonna like deal with this because they're already feeling rejected in a way.
Okay.
But again, a lot of this is subconscious. So especially for an avoidant, they're not necessarily aware they're feeling that way, but that's usually what's going on a deeper
Mhm.
level.
This is why we gotta do at least our own healing. We can't control
Mhm.
anybody else's, but we can
Exactly.
heal our attachment, our core wounds, our attachment styles, and go in the direction of more secure, which we're gonna get to, because that's I've done a lot of work there. And I think I've really healed a lot of those anxious attachment wounds. I think I'm still working on some of the avoidant ones, but anxious, like
Mhm.
we're pretty good there. And I'm gonna ask from, yeah, your perspective, some of the healing that happened in your own life too. I want to spend one more moment here in the, yes, with anxious and avoidant and how they show up in dating, and talk about some of the ways, specifically with communication,
Mhm.
that the anxious may, yeah, let's start with anxious. Like I'm thinking like what you
Mhm.
were just saying, it's, why didn't you text me back kind of thing. It can come
Mhm.
across sometimes as blaming or accusatory. Yeah, so some of the ways anxious and avoidant show up in our communication, or don't.
Yeah. Mhm,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say I think, like, like I said earlier, like, the anxious person, they start out really suppressing themselves, so they
Mm,
avoid the hard
okay.
conversations, they
Okay.
avoid, like, "What are you looking for?" Like, "Here's what I'm looking for." They think that will push people away or scare them off,
Okay.
and then what happens is they're, like, building, like, this anxiety up. They're like suppressing, like that anxiety has to go somewhere. And so what happens is instead of communicating their needs and
Mm,
saying what they need, they start being suspicious and they analyze behavior and they text five of their friends screenshots and say, what does this mean? And what is it? And then they get all this advice
okay.
and all these opinions.
Okay.
And then they're like, okay, yeah, he is avoiding me or he is an asshole or this is happening,
Yeah.
and then they get fired up and then it's like I think the subconscious is like I'm feeling like this person's about to reject me, so I'm going to get ahead of it. So maybe they come across really accusatory. I think an anxious person feels more comfortable being like mad and sassy than like being vulnerable and saying like, hey, like, my feelings were hurt when I didn't get a text yesterday, or something going on, versus like, what are you doing? Like, I don't like you were like you weren't busy last night. You were
Yeah.
home. My
Yeah.
friend
Yeah.
saw you at this bar, blah, blah, blah. And there's like these accusations that come out, and that's where the self-sabotaging behavior really shows up
Okay.
with the anxious person as they start to get really suspicious, really untrustworthy, really maybe a little bit combative, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, which of course is gonna, I mean, push an avoidant away for sure if that's the
Mhm,
dynamic, but I think push really anyone away, as it's there's not really a communication there of needs, it's, or a
mhm,
vulnerability like you were saying. It's more so just that reaction out of emotion,
mhm.
as the
Yeah, because
anxiety
there's so much
comes. Yeah,
suppressing. I'm not like
yeah,
being honest with how I feel. So then I become reactive instead of
yeah,
grounded
yeah.
and like I'm just voicing what I'm feeling. I'm reacting to all this anxiety in my body.
Yeah.
And that's something I'll talk to you about in a second too, of
Okay.
in the healing part of like what you can do with that. But I'll also say, like, if you're dating someone secure, you're not going to feel anxious enough to act that way. Because they're not going to like not text you back for a few days, and they're not going to like say they're going to do something and then not follow through. Like, they're pretty consistent and reliable.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get into that maladaptive behavior because there's no reason to.
Yeah. So it's so true. It's kind of like, if they're whoever he, she, they is interested in you, you won't be confused. I think there's some nuance to that where it's like, yes, the way someone else is showing up and communicating and showing and being there for you, great. But you've also then got to believe that you're worthy of that kind of respect and that treatment and that style of love. So up to you to do some of that healing. And is the avoidant, just quickly, like, are they classically just non-communicative? Is that true?
I would say they're a lot more communicative if they're dating someone secure. And so that's a part of the healing process too, especially for the anxious person. But the avoidant too is like learning to be attracted to someone secure, because dating someone secure will help you heal your nervous system so much by experiencing constant consistency, reliability. So a secure person is also not going to trigger the avoidant, because if the avoidant pulls back a little bit and is slower to respond, the secure person's not going to think anything of it. They're going to go about their day, and then they're not going to do anything sabotaging. And then that avoidant person's eventually going to text them, and they're just going to respond in a normal, kind way.
Yeah.
And, they're not going to trigger the avoidant. And so the avoidant will probably be more communicative with the secure person, because it's the anxious person that, is double texting, or they're, like going to like Instagram and like posting a story and like, responding to Instagram over here, that might be pushing the avoidant person into their maladaptive coping of not communicating very well.
Okay. This has been so fascinating. You know a lot of stuff about this. This is it's really, really cool. We're gonna get into healing. I just wanted to ask you this one more quick question here, because there's a lot of flirties of all genders, all identities listening. And so I think oftentimes it's, the guy is sort of is the avoidant, and the girl, the woman, maybe the anxious. That tends to be the reputation, but it can go.
It can go any way. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that if we're looking at socialization, right, and like maybe a female is kind of socialized to be talked to more emotionally, maybe the parents are more emotionally attuned to the female, so females might tend to be a little bit more anxious, a little bit more responsible for people in the family's emotions, and males may tend to be more socialized in the way of like, dad not showing emotion. This is what it's like to be a quote unquote man. So if we're getting into like non-binary and they, them pronouns, right? Like it's complicated, because they might have grown up maybe in that traditional male role with dad kind of pushing what it's like to be a man, what it's like to be masculine. So we don't talk about emotions. So they would still maybe not learn to be very emotionally available as well. And then, parents don't always follow the gender roles. And so everything's all over the place there, right? But I would say there's probably a reason we're a little bit more skewed in believing that women tend to be anxious and men tend to be avoidant. But it's really, I know a lot of female clients that are very avoidant. So it really can be anyone, any gender, can be any attachment style.
All right. That's really helpful. And I'm glad you mentioned the socialization piece too, right? How we're raised. Now we're conditioned to just care for people or show up, right? If you're a guy, right? Don't cry, right? Don't show weakness, kind of thing. I'm glad we're sort of starting to come around on a lot of that now. So Lauren, some of the ways that you started to heal your anxious attachment, where can the flirties start? Maybe they're deep in their healing. Maybe they're just getting started. Yeah, a few steps.
Yeah. Well, so I think a big thing that I don't like, which might surprise you, is this idea of like learning to be securely attached. I think that's a great goal, but that's like a long-term goal and that's a lot more complicated than people realize. So
Okay.
something I notice, especially with people anxious, is they like might read the book Attached and learn about attachment styles. And instead
Classic.
of like learning how to heal, they start reading about the avoidant and they're like, oh, this is the avoidance wounds and this is what they need. Okay, so this is how I need to show up for them to get them to love me.
Yeah.
Right. And I say that as someone who did that. Right. I was like,
100%.
ooh, okay, like I get it. I know what they need. I just need to love them hard enough and then they will realize that they're safe with me and then we'll run off into the sunset and be happily in love because I think a lot of anxious people don't think they can be attracted to emotionally available partners.
Okay.
And so I like to say don't focus on becoming secure, focus on self-soothing.
Okay.
And that's just a really good goal for every attachment style, right? Because like if we're looking at anxious and avoidant and disorganized, they all have maladaptive coping skills. And something I teach my clients about is this concept called the pain cycle.
Okay.
And so I'll try to make this simple. It's pretty much the pain cycle is a concept really like to do with attachment,
Mhm.
cognitive behavioral therapy, and mindfulness. And it really kind of brings all of them together. And so I want you to think like a negative core belief that a lot of anxious people might have. And there's so many different ones. Everyone's unique, but I'm just going to do a generic one. As an anxious person might feel like they're too much. So they might have this negative core belief that I'm too much. And so
Yeah.
what do they do to cope with that feeling? They overanalyze, they try to get ahead of it, they try to like act different, like kind of pretend to be someone they're not.
Yeah.
And then what is the outcome of acting that way? Well, then they push people away, they, scare people away, whatever that is, and then they come back to feeling like they're too much. So they're just like really like imprinting that feeling of not being or being too much. And then the avoidant, a common one is like, I'm not good enough. And so when they don't feel good enough, what do? They pull away from people. Maybe they retreat. They don't communicate well. The outcome is they don't have any good, healthy relationships in their life or they feel alone. And then that leaves them to not feeling good enough as well. And so a big thing is, okay, how do I learn to cope differently? I'm going to be triggered in dating. Dating is super triggering, right? Like we're going to experience rejection. We're going to experience insecurities along the way. So I'm probably, if I have this deep programming of I'm too much, I'm probably going to feel triggered a lot when I go on dates and I'm going to worry I talked too much on that date or that I said too much or I got too vulnerable. And so I might come home and feel like I'm too much. And so my maladaptive urge might be to text my friends advice on what to say to this person. It might be to, not tell them that I had a good date and not text them and wait for them to text me.
Yeah.
Right. It might be whatever it is that actually leads us to continue in this vicious cycle that's really unhealthy.
Okay.
And so self-soothing is going to be the best thing that you can learn how to do. And part of that work is learning self-trust first and foremost. So like as a single person who you're not in a relationship, there's a lot of healing that has to be done in relationship or at least in dating, but definitely in relationship because we're not going to be triggered when we're just single, not dating, just doing our own thing. We can be like, I'm so confident, I'm so secure, I'm like living my best life. And then I start dating again and all of a sudden my triggers come back.
Yeah.
But one thing you can do to help yourself with that is to work on healthy coping skills when you're not triggered. So making that a consistent thing you're always doing. If you only try to do the healthy coping skills when you're triggered, they're not going to come very naturally. So you really have to start showing up for yourself in all these different ways. So a big one I would start with is self-trust.
Okay.
Make small promises to yourself that you can keep.
Okay.
Right. And build on that. So that might mean I want to wake up 5 minutes earlier. So I'm going to do that and I'm going to actually follow through because I know I can do that. It's just 5 minutes.
Yep.
I'm going to keep my own word. So there's a lot of working on trusting yourself so you can start trusting your decisions and your intuition in dating.
Okay.
I would say that's a big one. Another one, right, is going to be how do I cope when I'm triggered, when I'm feeling like I'm too much or I'm not good enough?
Okay.
You are going to feel that way in other areas of your life, maybe with your parents, maybe with a sibling, maybe with a friend, maybe at work. You're going to have days where you don't feel good enough or you're triggered. So, how do you cope with that on your own? Are you going to go home and drink because no one's holding you accountable and you can just like drink a whole bottle of wine to yourself? That's escaping. That's numbing.
Yeah.
So, instead, how can you show up for yourself differently?
Mm.
You notice your urge, you ask yourself, okay, what am I feeling right now? I'm not feeling good enough. Okay, what do I usually do when I don't feel good enough? I drink or I overanalyze or I second guess myself.
Okay.
Okay, but what is the truth? The truth is I am probably good enough.
Yeah.
And so if that's the truth, what can I do instead? Oh, I'm going to take a cold shower to regulate my nervous system.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to this, yoga class that's restorative and slow down and get into my body.
Mm-hmm.
Also focus on like really easy coping skills that you can do anywhere, like deep breathing.
Yeah.
Your breath is so powerful.
Yeah.
And so finding these tools, it might sound unrelated to dating, but it's so related because then you start showing up in dating and instead of having the urge to self-sabotage or push someone away or accuse them of something, you start checking in with yourself and you go, what am I feeling right now? I'm not feeling good enough. Okay, so what do I usually do when I feel this way? I act a certain way, but I'm going to go do this opposite thing that's actually good for me and then check in with how I'm feeling. And then, especially for anxious people, start asking yourself, what do I feel about them? What do I think about them? That's like such a big one because I think in general, both avoidance and anxious people, they are so focused on the other person deciding their worth. So they're focused on that external validation. How is this person perceiving me? What do they think about me? How do they feel about me? And that is, of course, going to ruin your self-esteem in dating. So you really have to reframe that. It's going to happen. It's going to be triggered. You're going to feel that way. But you need to go, okay, no. What do I feel about them? Yeah. Did I have fun on that date? Did I find their behavior attractive? Do I like their communication style? No, I don't. And really realizing if you are someone with an anxious attachment and you're single, do not try to make it work with an avoidant. Yeah. If you're avoidant and you're single, don't try to make it work with someone who's anxious. Like, of course, if you're already in love and you're in a relationship, you have different attachment styles, there's a way to make that work. But the whole point about dating is I'm single and I get to find the best match for me. So stop, especially with anxious people, stop trying to force it with someone who's so triggering to your nervous system and your childhood wounds and go, this is going to be so difficult. And there's so many people that could be a great match for me. Why would I try to like regulate my nervous system all the time and prolong my healing? Yeah. Instead of go, you know what, this person's a great person, but they're not a good match for me. Yeah. I need someone who's a better communicator because that's going to make me feel good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many good healing strategies because we got some questions for this episode, whether, if you're dating, if you're in a relationship, but also for the single flirties that are looking to heal outside of dating or in a relationship. Really important, to keep in mind that yes, dating is going to bring up a lot of stuff for you, and that's okay. But it's about having those coping skills, those coping mechanisms to go to. Interrupting that pain cycle was a really cool process or example that you took us through. And then the mindfulness self-soothing piece is going to be wildly important for all the attachment styles, particularly I think for the anxious, so that you can regulate your nervous system and slow down when you're feeling super overwhelmed, just feeling super in your mind, overanalyzing, overthinking everything, so that you can ultimately move towards developing more secure connections, more secure attachments, which are rooted in being honest with yourself, knowing what you're looking for, what you want, and voicing what that is. Like, that is such a big part of healing that you can practice
in all of your relationships at work, with friends, with family, right? Bring some of these coping
Mm-hmm.
skills when you're triggered in your other interpersonal and interpersonal relationships, right? All of them. You get to use all of these as testing grounds, so to speak, to practice new ways of building self-trust and showing up for yourself and developing new coping skills. Like that's, I think for me, one of the biggest changes I made in healing anxious attachment and going to more secure, whereas I don't hide my needs anymore. Like what I'm looking
Mm-hmm.
for, you're gonna know. And when it comes to communication, so much of what you're talking about is very true. If it's a crazy busy day, I'm working all my jobs or I'm in between recording episodes, if it's someone
Mm-hmm.
I'm dating or even a friend, it might be, hey, like I see your message, want to let you know I got it. It's going to be a little bit before I can respond, but I'm at least
Mm-hmm.
going to communicate with you in a way that I hope is empowering and just let you know that I'm here, right? I'm not trying to ignore you or avoid you or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you really will notice some of these things with the person that has of that more secure
A hundred
attachment. Yeah.
percent. Yeah, and a secure person, if you say, "Hey, like, I would love it if you just text me a little bit more. Like, I'm still healing a little bit, and I get nervous. I
Right.
get a little triggered. I'm still working on some trust. It would just mean a lot to me if you checked in a little bit more throughout the day." A secure person is just going to be like, "Oh, no problem."
Yeah.
They're not going to think anything of it. Versus an avoidant might be like, "Oh, okay," like, and struggle with that or get mad at you.
Yeah.
But I want to point out too for the avoidance that their nervous system also they need to work on coping skills too because
Yeah.
their coping right is like push, pull away, ignore, shut down, ghost because they're avoiding vulnerability. And so avoidants need to learn like they're not good enough and what are they feeling and realize their maladaptive coping skills of pulling away. I think a lot of avoidants will escape or numb
Mm,
with drugs or alcohol or even like gaming, right? Like kind of trying to go into a world where they can avoid
yeah.
all their emotions. And so
Yeah.
them working on, figuring out how to soothe in different ways, how to actually lean into vulnerability, figure out what they're feeling.
Yes.
And therapy can be a good way to do
Absolutely.
that.
Therapy for the win, for sure. And after you go to therapy, come to my yoga class, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We'll regulate your nervous
Exactly.
system. We'll
Yes.
self-soothe. This is the one of the big reasons why I do my flirt yoga, why I've got my yoga videos up on FlirtTube. It's because you have got to find a way, regardless of if you're dating, you're in relationships, you're taking a break, doesn't matter what your status is or
Mhm.
where you're at, your ability to self-soothe and just connect more deeply to yourself so that you can really connect to your intuition, your inner knowing, your true self, so that you can show up authentically, right? It's just this loop, this cycle that
Mhm.
feeds in to one another. But it's so important to, yeah, just be able to calm your nerves and calm your mind so that you can just
Mhm.
think with that clarity, right? Yeah.
100%.
And not take everything so personal all the time. And it makes a big difference.
Yeah, that ability to start depersonalizing and seeing
Yeah.
other people's behaviors as like their stuff, their what they're going through, they're acting a way that because they're coping with whatever's going on in their life has nothing to do with you. It really doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's like one of the most freeing places you
Yeah.
can get. And, like yoga and deep breathing and anything physical within your body can be
Hmm.
so helpful, especially slowing down, doing like slow yoga flows
Yep.
is so helpful for people who aren't connected to their emotions
Absolutely.
because that's a really great place to start is like noticing what you're feeling in your body.
Yeah. And a great teacher too. That's exactly the kind of classes I teach, these slow flows. I say be more, do less. The only thing you need to do is be and breathe. I will guide you through the rest. And if it's uncomfortable, because sometimes we feel the need, right, to always be
Mhm.
doing, doing, doing. Our mind is racing and starting to slow down, bring space into
Mhm.
all of that can be really uncomfortable if you're not used to it. But think about with creating that space, what may
Mhm.
start to fill that space: appreciation,
Mhm.
love, gratitude, connection, fulfillment, excitement, creativity, new ideas, new coping
Mhm.
mechanisms, self trust, right? You can fill that space instead with worry, with anxiety, with overwhelm, overthinking, with lots of other amazing things as my God, these conversations, I feel like we just hit record.
I know.
Honestly.
I could go on and on and on.
Gosh, this was fascinating. I want to send all the flirties your way to learn more about you, even work with you. Yes, check out your content. Where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me on Instagram at Dating with Flo. And there you can find how to work with me as a therapist. Right now, I have a waiting list, but new spots might be opening up in 2025. If you are not in California, then you might be interested in my dating coaching, which I can work with anyone, anywhere. And I really do a lot of deep work in coaching too, because
Yes.
part of it all is about healing.
Yes, please check out Lauren, follow. And when you do, look at the stories because you are often, like very often, going in depth and in deep. I can really tell your passion for healing comes through in your work, as it definitely did today. Just thank you so much for being a part of this conversation and on Flirtations.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun talking with you, and I could really talk to you all night about this.
All right, flirties, that's a wrap on this episode of Flirtations. Thank you so much to our guest today, Lauren Zamora, for sharing so much about attachment theory, attachment styles, and the core wounds behind the two big attachment styles. I know I myself am learning so much about this topic, kind of coming around to it, resisting it for a little while, didn't fully understand. I wasn't fully on board, but now that I'm getting it, yes, doing my best to understand, to learn, to really take it in and ask myself, what do I think about this? How does this apply to me? I'm able to make some cool new connections, do some healing. Yeah, it's all been really, really rewarding. And I hope it's been rewarding and fulfilling for you to listen to this episode today. Thank you so much for listening, for tuning in, for streaming, wherever you may be in the world. Could not do this without your listens, your downloads, your comments, your support. Yeah, it's really, really wonderful. And I hope you just get lots out of this episode and all the other episodes, truly, honestly, taking exactly what you need, making a new connection or two. Yes, something shifting into place for you. That's what it's all about. All right, signing off officially here at Flirt Headquarters. My name is Benjamin. I'm the flirt coach and gay Libra. Flirty. Happy flirting.